Now, in the United States, it paid to do it because pension funds like California, CalPERS, state of New York, they said, we're only going to do business with firms that adopt these progressive commitments. Well, they said, you know what? Those are where the biggest checks are coming from. That's the tune we're going to dance to. And so in a certain sense, when the economic incentives were set up that way, it wasn't altogether surprising that people responded to those incentives.
All right, you gave me a lot of avenues to go down. So let's back up for a second, because obviously I want to talk about Strive and I want to talk about the new book. But Woke Inc., I mean, basically, you were laying out that this woke thing that we were all seeing, it's going through the universities, it's on television everywhere, you turn on Apple TV, that it's not just sort of this organic thing coming from kids off Tumblr, that there actually is an organizational ideology behind it. So can you talk about that a little bit? Because people always ask me, either when I do Q&As on the show or I go out publicly, where is it coming from? What is driving it truly?
Yeah, so I mean, look, that took a whole separate book length work to describe. But one of the things I said in that book was that it was when wokeness met capitalism that it actually became unstoppable, when it was supercharged with the dollars that flow through our system of free market American capitalism. That's when it really became not just a challenge to the system, it became the system. And it happened in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. And I saw this firsthand, right? I got my first job at that hedge fund in New York City in the fall of 2007 on the eve of the 2008 crisis. And the long story short, and it is a long story, and it was my last book, so we could go on for hours about this one, but the short version of it is that Wall Street realized they could go from being the bad guys after the 2008 crisis to being the good guys if they just said the right things. Muse about diversity and inclusion, the unjust impact of climate change after you fly in a private jet to Davos. It's pretty good work if you can get it. It was a cynical arranged marriage, though, between two partners in that marriage that did not particularly love or respect one another. Big business and the neo-progressive woke movement. But together, they were each able to get something out of the trade. It was more like mutual prostitution. And that was what led to the birth of Woke Inc. It wasn't just woke, and it wasn't just the ink. It was both of them. And that's what that whole tale was about. I will tell you that over the course of writing that book, though, I was interested in both the corporate cynicism behind it, which is what that book ended up being about, but I was also interested in the content of the underlying ideology as well. And so the publisher kind of told me, and advisors who helped me put that book together said, look, you got to pick one or the other. Start with the first one. And then actually the unfinished work was what led to Nation of Victims, which is the book that I'm putting out now. So, that was a bit of the journey of the two books. The first one was really about the corporate financial fuel, and the second book is really about the underlying fire, the conflagration on which corporations threw that fuel. And together, I think they describe
I
the
assume
problem.
that the irony should not be lost on anyone, that as you describe it, it was capitalism that allowed this thing to be unleashed, which is virulently anti-capitalist?
Of course. And you know what? Ludwig von Mises, a famous economist, Schumpeter, Joseph Schumpeter himself, said very similar things. This is early 20th century stuff from von Mises, that capitalism creates a psychological need filled by anti-capitalism. Schumpeter kind of predicted the same thing, the system of creative destruction, but first capitalism gives rise, necessarily paves the way to socialism. That was kind of Schumpeter's thesis. And it's interesting, we see their predictions play out in the moment that you and I live in. I mean, you're technically a millennial. You're a millennial as well?
I'm 46, my friend. I am
So you're on the other side of the bridge.
I am Gen X. Okay. I am Gen X.
You look good, man. So I don't know, but I'm a millennial. So I'm 37 now. So my generation, I was going to say our generation, but we'll call it my generation.
I have a lot of younger friends.
That's good. Whatever. You get it. It's a spectrum anyway. Your generation, sort of the younger part of your generation counts in this. But the millennials in particular, we're on the receiving end. I mean, I'm personally not on the receiving end of this, but millennials as a generation are on the receiving end of the largest intergenerational wealth transfer in human history. And there's something about that creates this psychological need for self-criticism and criticism of the very system that created the wealth that you're otherwise going to be on the receiving end of, but without actually making the sacrifice of giving up that inheritance be able to apologize for it with this new self-found consciousness of your privilege or whatever it is that lies at the heart of the apologism that characterizes, and I don't even use the word woke anymore because it's sort of become a tired word, but the modern neo-progressive movement, the apologist culture that's really at the heart of my next book, which is the victimhood culture that permeates our American fabric today.
Are you surprised that it rampaged through so many businesses? I mean, businesses that were or should be based on actual numbers. It's one thing, okay, it rampages through an entertainment company, you know, somebody making movies, TV shows, et cetera, but like seemingly everything, accounting firms and banks, like the whole freaking thing that, you know, these are people that actually have to look at numbers and make sense based on reality, or at least are supposed to.
Yeah, you know, at first it's surprising. Of course, it's counterintuitive, right? That's why it made for an interesting book. But when you examine it, it's actually not surprising at all, because it serves the interests of many of the people who are the biggest propagators of this new ideology. I mean, look, Larry Fink at BlackRock used this as a philosophy to aggregate over $10 trillion, creating the world assets under management. That's something that he couldn't have done if it weren't for filling the void created by the 2008 financial crisis and telling people that this was actually the new capitalism itself. And so, you know, I think the people on top, by the way, without saying an iota about those same words in China, how do you know it's in their self-interest? You talk about ESG or DEI or CSR or whatever your favorite three-letter acronym is. When they go over to the other three-letter acronym from ESG, DEI, and CSR to CCP, to be able to do business in China without saying a peep about ESG or DEI, because that's what it pays to do over there. Now, in the United States, it paid to do it because pension funds like California, CalPERS, state of New York, they said, we're only going to do business with firms that adopt these progressive commitments. Well, they said, you know what? Those are where the biggest checks are coming from. That's the tune we're going to dance to. And so in a certain sense, when the economic incentives were set up that way, it wasn't altogether surprising that people responded to those incentives. I think, you know, in my new book is Nation of Victims, we sort of talk about that. I talk about that at the individual level as well. Why is victimhood culture so rampant in the United States? It's a bit of a curiosity, right? You know, we have living in the most prosperous moments in human history and in American history. Why is it then that we fashion ourselves to think of ourselves as victims in every given direction? Black victims, white victims, second generation Asian victims. I mean, it's everywhere. We've, in certain senses, created an incentive structure in our country that rewards someone for characterizing themselves as a victim rather than as a victor. And so I think that, you know, it's not a sort of a cheesy humans respond to incentives kind of argument all the way down, but that is an important part of the story. And it's certainly a part of the story that makes it less surprising than you'd otherwise think.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about politics instead of nonstop yelling, check out our politics playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, watch our full episode playlist all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.